I always pick the hardcore beats for Caryma because she's hardcore. Um, and yeah, Caryma Sa'd is our guest today. Just a quick intro because I've been talking about this for days, and I'm really happy to have Caryma on. Um, I just have I'm totally speculating, and I have this theory, and the theory goes like this: ever since GoFundMe, after Parliament voted unanimously to bring him in for questioning, to talk about the 10 million bucks raised for the convoy. It was either that day, Caryma will set me straight on this. It was either that day or less than a day later or something like that, where they decided to pull Caryma's GoFundMe page. Even though I've scoured it because I like to do my due diligence, especially when it comes to Caryma because she's tricky. But I scoured her page. I cannot find anything that would like rise to the level of hate speech or rise to the level of fraud or anything like that. Like rise to the level. Like there's no evidence at all of any sort of mismanagement of her account. Everyone knows what she's been doing since this pandemic started. So it's weird that they would just do that now. So my theory is that what they're doing is hedging their bets because they were afraid that when the Conservatives questioned them in the House of Commons, that they won't have a good answer for whether or not they're biased against conservative protests. And so I think that they arbitrarily banned Caryma and maybe others for that reason. But anyways, we'll let Caryma set us straight on that. Caryma Sa'd, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Caryma just got out of the shower because she knew that she was going to be on the podcast with me, and
I wanted to be fresh and clean and ready to go.
The contrast is startling. Now I feel all dirty. Am I way off on what I'm thinking here? Before we go, this is so the MPs voted to call GoFundMe to testify at the Commons Committee on the convoy protest. That was February 3rd, and then I don't remember what day it is because it doesn't say there, but I think it was the 5th. Caryma, you wrote, "This is one of the hardest and most painful threads I've ever written. I got screwed by GoFundMe. My gonzo journalism of auto occupation was arbitrarily deemed prohibited content or conduct. Not even prohibited content, just prohibited conduct. I don't even know what that means. If you'd like to support my work, please send an e-transfer to caryma.sat@gmail.com." Now, what am I off on like, I know it's all speculation. I've reached out to GoFundMe executives, but I haven't heard back yet. But just give me your thoughts on how this all unfolded and where it leaves you now.
I think your theory is plausible. I also think that because there was so much hullabaloo surrounding Ottawa and the Truckers Convoy and other sort of Ottawa related incidents, that GoFundMe just didn't want any of that smoke. And so it's interesting because I actually had two separate fundraisers up, and only the one that referred specifically Keep Caryma in Ottawa, which happened to be the larger one, that's the one that got yanked. And there are so many possible explanations. I think that I wouldn't be surprised if I was mass reported, because there were a number of people kind of leading up to this happening who criticized the existence of a GoFundMe, my intentions, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think it's possible I was just collateral damage in sort of this effort to distance itself as far away as possible from Ottawa. And, to your point about not wanting to seem partisan, I think that, yeah, again, that's plausible. And the way that my GoFundMe was deactivated, very different than what we were hearing about in the news, surrounding the truckers and how they had opportunity after opportunity to show how the money was going to be used. There were sort of back and forth exchanges, and an ultimate determination was reached, but with input and with an opportunity to respond. And I was denied any of that due process, probably because it was a comparably smaller amount, and I'm a comparably smaller individual.
Yeah, I mean, and I can't tell. Maybe you know about this, maybe you don't. I don't know, but I can't tell. Like the mass reporting thing always gets to me because it's like, okay, like anyone that's like vandalism. Like you could do that to anybody. It feels like if it was a GoFundMe page for someone famous and it was mass reported, that it probably wouldn't have been yanked. Like it feels like they can do their due diligence when they want to, but then sometimes they don't. And I can't tell if an algorithm is pulling people's accounts, but that wouldn't make any sense to me because it's not like there's millions and millions of GoFundMe campaigns that are happening. Like human beings could handle that kind of content. But I kept on thinking about Patreon because they never really bounced back from their political stance, which went the opposite way. I don't know if you remember that, but Patreon, was it Jordan Peterson that they removed? It was like that kind of thing. It was like people that were considered alt right or whatever were completely removed from Patreon, and then there was like this mass exodus from Patreon itself, from like right leaning conservative content producers. And this just has a vibe that it's almost like they saw the errors of Patreon's ways and decided that they were going to even the score by taking people like yourself and pulling it down. Like there's nothing that I could find on your account that would even be considered improper conduct, whatever the fuck that means.
No, I mean, and that is by design, because as much as I enjoy kind of being out on the streets and having fun and doing a little bit of trolling, like I am also accountable to the Law Society of Ontario. So
Yeah.
I have very, you know, clear parameters on what I can and cannot do. I cannot do illegal things, and I don't want to. But also, even sort of in towing that line, I don't really have an interest in furthering sort of hate speech, right? Or anything that could be construed as such. I appreciate that maybe in my comment section, which I can't control, I get people from all sides of the political spectrum saying their piece, and it can be sort of a war zone sometimes. But that I don't think is what was at issue. And what was frustrating, you know, apart from not being able to appeal or really have any sort of conversation about, you know, why this happened. I got this canned response that, you know, it's prohibited conduct. Don't bother replying to this email. There's nothing we can do to help you. And it was just so defeating. Like, you know, I had a nap after being out for like 4 or 5 hours, was getting ready to go back out that night, and just it was, yeah, a sucker punch to the gut. And it's, you know, there's definitely an irony there, and I'm not one to have really called for GoFundMe to, like, as far as the trucker convoy funds go. I think it would have been better had they been dispersed, and, you know, then there would have been assets that could be sued for, or that could be recovered if in the event that that was necessary, right? Like the way that it transpired, that's not going to happen. So I was never really advocating for GoFundMe to deactivate their account. But I did tweet about it, and I was kind of sarcastic. So when it happened to me, it was just sort of ironic, which many people on the side of the truckers have pointed out, have been kind enough to point out. Um,
They're so thoughtful.
you know, it is what it is. Like, it sucked. Um, it sucked.
And you don't have to tell me the answer to this question, but I'm just curious by nature. But like, was it a lot of money that they froze?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a lot of money to me. So it was just over $7,000.
Okay, that's
So,
a
you know,
hit for a person that does the work that you do, though. Like,
well, I mean, I've been documenting these rallies for over a year now, and it's almost entirely self-funded, except for the odd time that I have done a GoFundMe. And you know that there's a lot of, you understand, like there's a lot of time and effort that goes into this sort of work. Um, Being out there, then actually dealing with the footage and coming up with captions and doing research to make sure that kind of I'm ready to discuss issues or can put proper context to things. So it when it was active, it felt very much like kind of a validation of those efforts. And yes, it was specific to Ottawa, but kind of my vision or plan went beyond that, and so it was disappointing. it was disappointing.
What kind of rules does go? Because I don't know anything about the platform, but what kind of rules does GoFundMe have regarding? Because they raise money. Correct me if I'm wrong. Specifically for individuals and organizations, but aren't they supposed to be both like nonprofit, or is that just for organizations?
I think that that's just for organizations. So, yeah, like if you are a nonprofit, then um, I believe that there are rules about how the money can be dispersed and to whom. If it's as an individual, then there's more flexibility associated with that, and that's how I was running it as an individual.
Okay. Because I gotta want to stick on this forever, but it feels like there's a lot of politics at play here. I kept on like looking. I was gonna draw like those detectives in like like old detective movies where they like get their whiteboard and they start like putting pictures up and then strings
For
from
sure.
like pictures to whatever that's called, flow
Like
chart,
that
but
meme
like
where you're like,
yeah, exactly. And there's all these players that I'm just like, again, totally speculating on, but like the anti-hate network and how cozy they are with the liberals, and how the liberals probably wanted GoFundMe to pull that, and how Navigator is the crisis management firm working for the Ottawa police, and if I feel like there's just a couple threads that we're missing here, where there's like some sort of collusion, not in the legal like a legal sense, but just like they're talking to each other and they're strategizing because all of them are scared shitless of optics. Now I know
it's
you don't
possible.
necessarily have
Yeah.
any evidence, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't at all. So I mean, and that's why it's possible, I guess. But I also think that, different actors and entities can sometimes have goals that overlap and, will either work deliberately together or are simply furthering each other's goals because they're all working on the same track, right? So
Yeah.
I really don't know. And there's just so much mess that's like associated with all of this that I think to unpack it just would require access to information that simply isn't going to be readily or publicly available.
Okay, let's switch gears. You're still in Ottawa, correct?
I'm still here.
What has changed from the sort of apex of the chaos and whatever you want to call it? I guess Saturday was sort of like the crescendo of all the craziness to now. Like what is different now? I know that the cops started taking away gas and things like that yesterday. Can you give me an update on just like how things are changed? Are they dying down a little bit? Are people still pouring in? Are people leaving?
I think, and so it's hard to say patterns because this is now week two, um, or it's the 10th day, so we're getting to the end of week two. Um, Last week, I felt that during weekdays, it was a bit more subdued. Um, and it was the weekend really that brought out the most people and had the most attention. Um, Last night, there were additional cinder blocks that were put along Wellington Street. I think to deter more trucks from coming in or to prevent trucks from kind of moving around. There was this notice about fuel being seized, and at the Coventry Road sort of park off. I don't know what to call it. I understand that there were some arrests made and some tickets issued. So we are starting to see more police enforcement than I've observed up to this point. But what's interesting is right now there are like dozens of people walking around the city of Ottawa just holding jerry cans. And I saw a guy drinking out
It's
of a
so
jerry
funny.
can. So it's
Oh,
hopefully water. I don't
did you say
know.
hi to my father? Because that would have been nice. You know.
Hopefully water or something that's not gasoline or diesel. Can't say for sure. But I think the strategy right now is to try to overwhelm and just confuse police, and just have so many jerry cans that, oh, we don't know what's what, um, which I don't know how successful that will be. Um,
Did anyone take a strategy course before before they went to
Honestly,
this?
honestly. I mean, I say that, but then there are aspects of this that are surprisingly well organized.
Can you give me an
So,
example? Yeah.
well, so there's a company out of Leamington that set up basically two pizza ovens, and it's like a food station. So people
Hmm.
can go there and eat, leave a donation if they're able, or just eat for free if they're not. So it's sort of, in any other context, I think I would applaud that initiative. But it runs fairly smoothly. And then there's other like food and donation tables that have popped up across the city. There was that soup kitchen that was built in Confederation Park and then moved elsewhere. So like there's parts of it that seem to run. Like I don't know how smoothly, but I'm kind of impressed that they were able to pull that off. Um,
You know,
but
they developed a pretty pronounced set of skills during Ribfest, and they just brought it over, right, to
transferable
Ottawa.
skills. That's right.
That's right.
Um, what's definitely lacking though is a clear set of achievable objectives, and there's no real communication or messaging apart from end mandates, which is simply like that's not a thing that the federal government can do on its own. And the way I've heard it explained is, well, if the federal government does it, the province are going to be pressured to do it, and like that's not how the Constitution works at all. So yeah, on that front, it's very poor.
I don't remember if you were on the podcast last week with Mark Burry, but he described the manifesto released by the organizers as crayon law.
I no, but that is, I think, a very charitable explanation of it.
Yeah, and look, I've been getting a lot of flack because I do like to analyze rather than take a side and stuff like this, and that doesn't mean that I'm giving equivalency, but the the lack of focus and the disjointedness. I mean, they're their own worst enemy, and it's interesting because I keep on seeing all this footage of like dance parties and people drinking and kids with "fuck Trudeau" signs and everything, and I'm just like, it feels like a Canada Day picnic, but there's also monster trucks. Like there's a monster truck rally that's going to happen on Sunday or something. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't have a feeling of a protest, and maybe that's my problem though. And I was thinking about this. I was trying to think about this really hard because I'm of two schools of thought. One of them is that I think that if all of the strategies and tactics that were employed so far in Ottawa were done by activists that were like, say, environmental activists or something, which would minus the trucks idling for a week because that's just stupid. But that most of the tactics would be seen as reasonable or at least not extreme or whatever. Like the extremist element, and correct me if I'm wrong because you're there, but the extremist element, as far as I can see, Pat King and his rants and stuff like that, a few pictures of nooses and swastikas and stuff. Although there's a running talking point among convoy protesters that claim that the Nazi stuff, a bunch of it was supposed to be a critique of the government. But whatever. Are we losing our ability to maintain this idea that you can protest peacefully because we keep on wanting to look at it through the lens of our positions?
It's a good question. I think that if this were for another cause, oddly enough, it would have been shut down much quicker. I don't think that we would have actually seen an opportunity to become as rooted as the truckers did. Is my first sort of reaction to that. And there's elements of this that I think would be intolerable from any group, most specifically the honking,
Yeah.
because it really is really really bad. It's, it's not happening right now, at least not from where I can hear it. But at times it was really bad and like very disturbing to see children among that. And I don't know whether they were wearing earplugs or not, but like, I know parents who think twice about taking their kids to the movie theater because they're afraid it's too loud. And maybe that's sort of the far end of the extreme, but I
I
would
saw
wear
I saw a lady
earplugs.
bring her daughter to a Snoop Dogg concert once, and I was like, "What the fuck are you doing?" Anyways, go on.
It's just, and I'm not like, I'm not one to judge parenting, but as a human being, seeing sort of a vulnerable child, and especially in a situation like this that's so volatile because the undercurrent is rage, right? And even though there's this party vibe that happens mostly, I would say, when Quebec pulls through on the weekend, and it is a good time. It's a snow rave. Well, good time for some, but it's still like based in anger, right? And it's still like fuck Trudeau is the common theme and element. And I wouldn't underplay sort of the violent rhetoric, like the nooses, like the effigy, that kind of thing. I believe that actually makes it harder for there to be a solution because how do you negotiate with that? Like that's personal attacks, personal abuse, in a way that goes beyond a policy critique. And I yeah, I'm uncomfortable with that, personally.
Did do you remember? Because I don't remember the media's reaction to. I'm not going to get what protest it was, right? But I thought it was. Um, how do you say that? CUPE, CUPE.
Yeah, QP.
Yeah. Anyways, it was the Queens Park protest from either last year or from 2020, where the union protesters or whoever they were at this sort of like left wing protest brought that guillotine out.
Yeah.
I don't recall the media's reaction to that. But would that be considered violence?
I think that in the same way, a noose, like I think that would be equivalent. Um, and both are making a political statement. The guillotine may be a bit more so because it's specific to the context of revolution and how, certain leaders were deposed, right? So that's like, and I guess there's leaders who get hung too, and there's leaders who get shot. So, it is a form of political messaging. I won't discount that, but it still makes me uncomfortable. And even like the guillotine, I can't say I was mad at it at the time. So there probably is something to your point, about whether you align with the values or purpose of the protest or not. But kind of with what I've seen here, like I don't think that is, it's not the direction that I would like us as a society to go. Um, Not at all. And back to the point about the swastikas and kind of Nazi imagery and it being not approving of that, but trying to draw a comparison between what's happening now and what happened under Hitler. Like I think that's just as offensive. I think that the use of that imagery, itself, like it evokes, especially for people who like have direct ties, right, to people who died, or were persecuted, under that regime. I think that just those symbols are violent inherently, and I think that the false equivalency itself, is a different form of, you know, is it violence? In a way, but certainly it cheapens history and it cheapens our understanding and perspective of things. And when you take an atrocity and then water it down and distill it so that I can't go into Canadian Tire without my mask, therefore I feel like I've been forced onto a train at gunpoint and separated from my family. Like it's
Yeah.
not the same. And there's like a lack of understanding and people who genuinely feel that yeah, I'm making an apt comparison. And historical comparisons at the best of times, you know, with scholars are tricky because there's so many variables and factors at play. So, you know, that I think is very, it's beyond uncool. I don't think that it's something that we should be endorsing or like, and I do my best to call it out. Um, but
That's the
yeah,
one thing
yeah.
that's been missing, right? Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
Mhm.
But that's just the one thing that's been missing. Like I'm dying to see the footage. If it exists, please send it to me. If someone's listening that has something like this, or has seen something like this, of protesters walking up to like guys wearing Nazi jackets or carrying those flags and confronting them. You know, like, and it would be better coming from their allies rather than a counter protester. But like, you know, if you want to make the case, and I'm just sort of speaking in general terms, but if they wanted to make the case that like, no, this isn't a rally based on hatred, then I give me the footage of 5 or 6 men built like brick shithouses walking up to Nazis and saying, fuck off, you know, take your shit and leave. I haven't seen any of that.
I saw one video, and I think it was a person carrying a Confederate flag, who was basically told that they weren't welcome there, that they were making others look bad. Um, and I don't have the full kind of context to that video, so I don't know if they had done anything prior to evoke that reaction. But I also know that one of the organizers has Confederate flags hanging in his garage. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt. And I agree. I think that it would have to come from within their own ranks. I think that kind of an average person who's not part of this convoy occupation, whatever it is, I think that they put themselves at significant risk by doing that.
Yeah, you said occupation. I retweeted something from the New York Times this morning that was calling it an occupation. I don't know if it's an occupation. Like, it feels like a mass loitering because occupation has like there's all these words. I was talking about this with Mubin Shaikh yesterday on the show, and we were talking about how terrorism has a definition, and extremism has a definition, and violence has a definition. Pretty sure occupation has a definition too, and I don't think it's driving a bunch of trucks and treating Ottawa like a parking lot and blaring your horns. Like occupation is a political term for the unlawful taking over of another entity's land. Like, and this would be like occupation would have to be like they're not in total control. They've been allowed to do what they are doing. Am I just like, am I too much of a stickler for definitions?
No,
Because
and I think actually definitions are especially important when you have factions that misuse words, right? So it becomes extra important to stick to definitions because otherwise language has no meaning. And what are we doing here, right? You know, and I can't say that I have the sort of academic definition of occupation to the extent that we have people who have rolled into the nation's capital, have set themselves down, have no intention of leaving, have created this infrastructure to support themselves and are, by their presence, effectively scaring residents, intimidating residents, harassing residents. And those are all things that I've seen and observed. It's not across the board. And, you know, uh, I've made this point before and elsewhere, but there are people participating in this protest who genuinely believe that they are doing the right thing, and I believe are deeply misled. But, you know, it's not that every single individual out here is like a thug trying to use this as an opportunity to just unleash that kind of antisocial behavior. But there are some, and like the inability to deal with those people, I think tars the entire group. and yeah, like the Rito Center is still closed, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this is now over a week, I think, that it's been closed. And so all of those people who rely on their shift work to pay
Yeah.
rent, to buy food, etc., like they cannot work. So, have they been like, is this an occupation in the sense that the mall has to close because they're scared of what's going to happen if the mall opens? Kind of. And, bus routes have been rerouted. People are having to take different sort of ways to get to work or school or wherever they need to be. Or, and I've seen people kind of crossing down Wellington with their masks on, going their usual way, but now having to kind of, it's hostile territory.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much hostile territory. So I don't have maybe the like I say, I don't have the academic definition, but I think there are elements of this, even though they haven't seized control of government. They are kind of creating their own um, in a in
Lord of
a
the Flies, like that. That's
yeah, right, in a
yeah.
very Lord of the Flies sort of
I want to
decentralized
be
way.
Piggy. I want to be Piggy. Sorry.
And the conch shell is the horns, all of the horns, and
Yeah.
everyone
Oh
has
my
it
god,
all of the time.
that's awful. I talked to Randy Hillier on the phone today, and he's he calls what the government is doing a coup d'état, and it was before 11 o'clock, so I don't think he was drunk yet, and I
That's a
was
bold
just like,
assumption, but
yeah, no, you're right. There's always still being drunk from last night too that I forgot about, but it was weird. Like I know him. I wouldn't say we're friends, but I know him enough to give him a call anytime I want and just shoot the shit about his theories about what's going on. And it's interesting how I couldn't really I couldn't reach him by just appealing to okay, Randy, I happen to disagree that it's a coup d'état. Don't you think that a lot of these measures are temporary? And he just would launch into this speech about governments and tyrannies, and I, I'm I'm surprised for some reason. I don't know why I keep on giving people like Randy Hillier and Max Bernier the benefit of the doubt, but I just don't want them to be that um, hyperbolic. And I used to think that they were doing it on purpose to try to gain support for their political careers, and now I think they believe it. And he's an elected person. He probably won't get elected again, I don't think. But he's part of the Ontario legislature, and he thinks the federal government is in the middle of a coup. I don't even know what my question is. I
no, that
just
this is that like that. There's also this notion of drinking too much of your own kind of Kool-Aid, right? So what may
I'm
start
glad you didn't
off
say urine.
as
I hate that story. I hate that story so much. Never talk about that. Go.
what started off maybe as kind of opportunistic politicking, which is, preying on people's emotions and fear, because I think that's what they're both very effective at. Um, and at some point, you start believing it yourself, right? Possibly. I mean, Randy was on Parliament Hill talking about how this is the hill we should all die on.
Yeah. I
And yes, that's words, and yes, maybe he's being figurative, but
I think he's
if we think about
inciting,
his
and I don't use
his
that word.
audience, yeah, it's for
Yeah.
sure inciting. Like
And
there's people
I don't
here.
like using that word. I mean, I was one of those guys that thought Trump had been inciting for months leading up to January 6th. And when Twitter cut off his account, in a way, I was just like, oh yeah, you guys are finally getting to that. I get he's the president, but he was saying fight, go march on the Capitol and fight. Like he was saying that. It was
Yeah,
like his who's the guy with the horse that said the British are coming?
Paul Revere.
Yeah, like it was like a Paul Revere moment for him in a sense, right? Like where he was just trying to warn that the government is stealing an election and you got to get up and fight. And it's like, and listening to Rand and seeing Randy's tweets when he's comparing munitions that dropped in Afghanistan, I think it was, and these jerry cans. Like you're I don't know if you're trying to be clever, but it looks like what you're saying is weaponize these gasoline canisters against the government.
It's deeply irresponsible. There was a thread I came across yesterday from a source that I would consider reliable and trustworthy, talking about people who appeared to be convoy supporters, like essentially setting up an apartment to burn, right? Like, so attempting arson. And it didn't strike me as impossible, and like the security camera footage seems to suggest that that's exactly what happened. And so yeah, you have a group like this of like anti-authority, anti-establishment, many of whom have probably like experienced significant loss, whether financial or familial relationships or whatever, and are increasingly isolated from kind of healthy community networks, if we can put it that way, may always have been isolated from such networks, and now are just loose cannons, right? So at any point, like there could be someone in the crowd who just hears something, takes it the wrong way, and then acts on it, thinking that this is what I was instructed to do. This is what is just. This is, I'm doing my patriotic duty. So like that's a real risk here. Despite the drunkenness in the streets and like kind of the funny stuff that's happening. And then we think about allegations from police that there may be foreign influences, whether financial or like through other forms of capacity building, that are playing into this, and it's extremely scary stuff.
Yeah, the foreign money stuff. I mean, I'm kind of with you on the idea that maybe they should have allowed the funds to sort of go through and then clawed it back, or at least like gave himself the opportunity to follow the money.
Yeah.
So that maybe like, but then talking to Mubin off the air yesterday, he was saying that he might have said this on air too, but that the FBI and Homeland Security had played a role in sort of like advising that money be frozen. So that says maybe that they were worried that it could be used to fund nefarious activities that would happen immediately. So the issue is so complex. I want to get back to the Nazi imagery stuff for a second though, because there's a part of me that feels like all I do is speculate because it's really hard to know answers. But I'm going to do it again. The right, especially MAGA people, were really upset that for years Donald Trump's hyperbole at rallies, especially, was Hitler-esque. Like it felt like for a lot of people like the mid to late 1930s in Germany when he would speak. And at the time, like I'm a big believer that you don't really compare anything to Hitler and the Holocaust because it's just too loaded for one thing. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is their revenge play. I have footage of a bunch of the people at the protest calling the cop stormtroopers, like and talking about how this is like, a tyrannical government and everything. Do you think that they're just getting vengeance for being like the Adolf Hitler comparison for 4 years? Do you think that we just both sides sort of have this habit that we should probably shed from our lexicon about comparing things to Hitler?
Yeah, we really lost the plot. And there's Godwin's law, right, where everything devolves into Hitler comparisons because it's just the worst thing anyone can think of. And I think that again, that cheapens kind of the reality of the Holocaust, and it's just unhelpful. Even where you can draw comparisons, it's just like, to what end? I think it's different to compare something to, like, if you were to say this has elements of fascism, right? That's
Yeah.
quite different. And then, you can say, then we can go a step further and say, for example, Hitler did this, but just making the analogy and then not providing additional context. Like, what's the, like, to what end again? Like, and there are elements of fascism that I see here. And I, it's ironic because it's a word that the freedom movement deploys quite frequently as well. So again, like divorcing things from meaning. But like, yeah, that needs to be called out. And I think that we're not doing a great job with that. We're not doing a great job countering it. And,
Hmm.
one of the most insidious aspects is that it's under the banner or guise of love and unity and freedom, but it's not freedom for all. It's not kind of success for all. So yeah, like
The
just
I just want to Greg Van Leuven. I think he's my Facebook friend. Yeah, he is my Facebook friend. Said I thought the stormtroopers comparison with Star Wars. Well, funny enough, Star Wars were largely like the Empire was largely inspired by Nazis. So you're both right, but they did call them stormtroopers. Another thing that I find interesting is that the Godwin's law thing. So that was started by Mike Godwin. I don't remember if he was a professor or what he was, but he actually came out and made things a lot more difficult about a year and a half ago because he came out and said, no, 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 no. Godwin's law is when you wrongly compare things to the Holocaust. But he then made it seem like Trump was on limits. So
hmm.
yeah, that kind of like made a lot of people a little bit pissed off. It's either
Incidentally,
a
like
law or it's not. You know,
there was a guy with a horse and a Trump flag here. So
I
it's
saw that.
just
Yeah.
like the cross border kind of spread of this is really intriguing, but also disturbing.
Yeah, there's a lot of these weird parallels. Like the right used to hate it when the left did that sort of showmanship stuff, like Trudeau on the horse going to meet the indigenous leaders. Or my favorite one right now is that when it comes to mandates, the only mandates that I think are going to be left as far as vaccines go, I think, are going to be federal employee mandates for vaccinations. That's 420,000 total employees. And out of that 420,000, most of them are vaccinated. But the greater point is that the right keeps on pointing to that. They don't even want those jobs to exist. Like they're always talking about shrinking government. And now they're fighting for unionized federal employee mandates to be overturned.
It's a
Like,
mistake to think that any of this is really about mandates or vaccines. That is, I think, like the talking point, and it's a convenient one, and it's one that they've been able to galvanize sort of support and interest around. But seeing how frequently the goalposts shifted, I have a lot of trouble believing that that's kind of the genuine concern here.
so what is then? I mean, other than the fact that it's a salad bar of Trudeau hatred talking points, everything from socks to vaccines. But like, what do you think if you had to narrow it down to one thing and sort of like trim the edges of all that minutia, single issue people with fuck Trudeau signs or whatever? Is it just I hate Trudeau, or what would how would you, if gun to your head, how would you sort of encapsulate what's happening and why they're there?
I hate Trudeau is a very big part of it, but I don't think it actually has all that much to do with Justin Trudeau as a person. And I think that really this is an attempt at subverting our form of democracy.
But but they're not smart enough to accomplish it. Is that sort of the the idea? Like we have
You
to
don't
laugh at this
have
a
to
little
be
bit.
smart.
But
You don't have to be smart to erode democratic norms and values. That's the problem. So I think that they will wittingly, unwittingly accomplish some of what they aren't even articulating as their goals, but is in fact a purpose here. And, I am not one for our first past the post system. I think that, it's it's
that was the big one for
undemocratic in
me.
ways, right? So I'm
That
not
was the
I'm not
big
a
one
fan
for
of.
me. Yeah, the big broken promise
Yeah, had that
was that
happened, I
one.
think,
Mm.
we would be living in a slightly different Canada right now. And there's others who have promised the same or whatever. But like first past the post is a problem. But even so, it's the system that we have, right? And this is, it's funny that Randy uses the word coup because like that's kind of what's happening out here. We need Trudeau to resign. We're here to make sure Trudeau gets fired and loses his job. But like, okay,
That
we had an election like 5 months ago,
yeah,
and
and
yeah,
that's
it
another
wasn't the outcome.
parallel. That's
Mm-hmm.
another parallel with the states, right? Because both sides were accusing the other side of conducting a coup,
Mm-hmm.
and it was, and again, it felt like okay, the insurrectionists or whatever you want to call the January 6th people, like you're literal. So they were convinced again because it's not the best and brightest. They were convinced that they were going to save a country while they planned on robbing it.
Yeah, it's
Like,
amazing what you can convince a group of people to do if they sort of feel it's morally just and you tug on the right heartstrings and there you go. Like so people are very malleable. Social media, is a game changer in the sense that we can't really there's no historical comparison to draw on. And in previous times, sort of propaganda, it was enough to have, an offensive or not offensive. It was enough to have a poster with like the Germans depicted as this or like Jewish people depicted as vermin or whatever. And that like persuaded people, right? So propaganda has existed long, long, long before social media and has been enough to take people and turn them into vicious, like beyond the pale sorts of behavior. So now we have this device that you keep in your pocket and like it sits beside your pillow and you use it on the toilet and you're constantly consuming information
hey,
that,
hey, no one saw me use it there. I've never used it there. Big believer in keeping that out of the bathroom. No, you're right though. You remember being a kid and being like, your parents would, not my parents because it was my babysitter, but good parents were like, don't watch TV because, oh, don't worry about it. They know they weren't good parents. It's okay. I saw you go cringe a little bit there, but
no,
don't
no,
worry.
not cringe. I like, it's,
But anyways, my point is
yeah.
that we were told that that's the boob tube. It's going to rot your brain, and now we carry one in our pockets. That
Mhm.
helps us get angry all the time at other people.
Yeah, it's designed to make you angry
Yeah.
all the time because that's
Yeah.
how they make money, right? Um, so yeah, it's very messed up, and that plus like a lack of media literacy, I think, and sort of the unwillingness or inability to think critically. And like we can't ignore the fact that there are legitimate grievances about the way that media and politics have operated. And the way that it is very much a clique and there's nepotistic elements to it. And you have people who want to return to their relatively simple lives and who, on some base level, understand that the government doesn't give a shit about them and are fed kind of this easy solution. And there are no easy solutions, but the people feeding that solution also don't give a shit about these people, right?
Yeah.
So they're like politically expedient and it's just this toxic combination of all of these factors and the erosion is not like a new thing. This has been happening for decades. And really, if we're honest with ourselves, even from the inception of our country, there are groups who were deliberately sort of excluded or persecuted, and upon who we like built the nation, right? So like the nation itself, like its roots are sick, and it hasn't really evolved into a super healthy tree.
Yeah. I had it took me a long time to really like come around to the idea of if a nation starts off the way that say Canada started with genocide and slavery, that in 2022 not that it shouldn't impact you as an individual or as a group, but that I let me start that over. I have a friend who's a black dude, and he told me once that I'm like Nigel, you're so nice, like you're like one of my nicest friends, and he's like, do you want to know why? I'm like, no. He's like, because whenever I went out, I was like I was told by my mom, and she was pretty religious, that I had to be especially polite because I'm black. And I got that. I got what he meant by that. And then he said something to me that I found hard to believe, but I understood why he believed it. He was like, "How many? What percentage do you think white people are like legit racist?" He's like, no, "I'm not talking about the subconscious kind, but I'm talking like the thoughts in their head are like, I hate black people or whatever." And I was like, I don't know, maybe 30. And I was like, why? What do you think? He's like, 75. I was like, and I don't know who's right. And my point is though, is that what I eventually realized is that the just as difficult as it is for generational wealth to deplete, and you have this downward mobility because you've lost billions of dollars. That is very unrealistic, but it's just as unrealistic to have generational poverty and to climb up to wealth. And I think a lot of white people, especially, don't really understand that second part. You know what I mean? And when I don't know what point I'm even trying to make here. I'm just like we have these strange ways of not sort of like seeing the issue from the other side's perspective. And sometimes you shouldn't, like skinheads or something. But sometimes, and I think this convoy is one of them. I think that they need to be able to like say something with one voice that isn't fuck Trudeau. And if they can't, then they need to go home. Because I don't think that the perspective that they're sharing is identifiable with most Canadians.
I am inclined to agree. All of the conversations I've had sort of center on personal struggles that people have endured during the pandemic. This idea that it's not right, it's not fair, I should have choice, but very superficial understandings or engaging with the concept of living in a society where you have to balance competing interests,
Mm-hmm.
and this sort of any deprivation is treated as like a personal attack, and that's not to say that there aren't real things to be upset about, but I think where people do need to be held accountable is throwing your hat in with organizers or like other people, and you're not really actually sure of their motives, or you're convinced that their motives are one thing but their actions suggest something else, and that support that you're providing to this movement is, I think it, like that's where things become dangerous.
I keep on circling back, and we have about 5 minutes left. But I keep on circling back in my own mind to the 2003 anti-war protests when the war in Iraq was about to start in Toronto. I don't know if you were there, but or where you were living at the time, or how old you were even. It was like 2003. But
2003, how old was I?
I have no idea how old you are. You could be like
14.
25 or like 70 because you look good, and I have no idea what how old you are. But anyways, I'm 45, so I was like 25 or something when the Iraq protests were happening, and we're never gonna have protests like that again. I felt the same way when I watched the Chicago 7 trial movie on Netflix, which by the way is great. I don't know if you watched that movie, but yeah, the Chicago trials. Do you know what it's about?
I'm
Yeah.
familiar with it. I haven't watched it though.
You should watch it. It's really good because what it did for me is like that's how to be activists. Oh my God, you guys are these. I listen every time I bring up this name, people accuse me of name dropping, but sometimes I just get reminded of shit. But I asked Noam Chomsky about that movie and about how if there was ever and if there's any lessons that present day activists can learn from activists in the 60s and 70s, and he was like, oh yeah, he was like they should be studying them because you know, they made things work, and they were able to mobilize without the internet, which is super important, I think. But the 2003 Iraq protests were filled with like libertarians and liberals and progressives and conservatives and religious people and atheists and all of these different like, you know, types of people all gathered, and there was actually 1 million people there, not the pretend million that Theo Fleury was thinking about. But you know, it was beautiful. Like I loved it. Like we were all there, maybe for different reasons, you know, but like we were all there supporting one thing. We don't want to go to war in Iraq. We don't want the United States to attack Iraq. It was simple, and there was unity there. I think those days are over, and I think that phrase, "the medium is the message," has turned into the social media has become the elephant in the room, and now the elephant is the medium. You know what I'm saying? Like, I just made that up. That could be totally nonsense for all I know, but I think I know what I mean.
I wonder, like, and you would think that something like a global pandemic, where sort of the enemy isn't really an enemy at all, and it's, you know, a virus, and that ought to have been a rallying force, and yet it seems like it has prompted a lot more division, or an opportunity to sort of further divide people. And we're so polarized, and how do we stop being polarized, I think, is maybe the question. And can we, like, can we revert back to that, like the anti-vax movement, ironically, like what you've described, where it's capturing different sort of segments of society, so too does the anti-vax movement, but I think in a more sinister way, um, because it will lead to deaths, right? So it's a death cult, but it's appealing to certain religious fundamentalists. It's appealing to people who, like minorities who distrust the government. It's appealing to sort of the left wing. I just do yoga and eat healthy. It's appealing to, like,
I buy floor pillows and statues of Buddha, even though I don't pray. Yeah.
yeah, like there's, you know, it's there's an umbrella kind of, it attracts all sorts of conspiracy theorists, right? Like I've seen flat earthers, I've seen kind of QAnon, I've seen like just everyone under the sun, kind of, right? Like, so not really, there's still like clear demographic trends, I think, but there is an appeal that's like a mass appeal, and that can't be our unifying movement. I really hope it isn't.
Yeah. Clinton says there's a long road back for some, many fences to be mended, and lots of crow to eat on both sides. Probably true. Before we go, I just want to know when this is over, if it ever fucking ends. What do you see yourself doing? Like this is like you're
I
like
don't know.
me, in a sense, because COVID prompted me to sort of get up and do a bunch of stuff that I had never done before. And I often tell people, the pandemic was so good for my career that if someone brought me a button to press that would save the 6 million people who died, I'd probably not press it just so I could keep my good career trajectory. But you know, but what about you? You know, if this all goes away, is the answer simple? Like you're just gonna, you know, establish your practice and practice law and do stand up for tenants and the odd landlord that might be right, because usually they're not right. Usually it's the landlord.
I don't know. It's a very good question, and it's like so hard to future plan right now, because everything is just up in the air. Um, I really like this niche I found of. I think of it as public education, even though there's a lot of junk food with it. I try to incorporate some morsels of intelligence. And, you know, I think that there's people who are receptive to that. So if I can find a way to continue doing that in some way, shape, or form, you know, I'm happy doing this, even though it's in deeply unhappy circumstances.
You know what I could see you
I don't know.
doing? I could see you doing. Do you remember Humans of New York?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
that
I
book.
like that series. Yeah.
I could see you doing a podcast that is like that, where you like walk around Trinity Bellwoods, find an interesting person, and talk to them on a bench for 45 minutes. I could
No,
see you
I
doing
will.
that and nailing it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
See, okay,
you
see,
know.
I would maybe I will when we're allowed to
Yeah,
talk to
I want
strangers
credit
again.
for that, and I want the producer's job, and I want to just be able to tell people what to do. So if you can make that happen,
We'll talk.
okay, good. Caryma Sa'd, thanks so much for joining us. You're about to go on the Dean Blundell show, I think, in about an hour, so we'll see you on there as well.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks, Caryma. Bye.
Bye.
Caryma Sa'd. She's awesome. I love having her on the show, and yeah, imagine that. Imagine that as a podcast. Caryma walking through like I make it sound like it's like Caryma walking through parks and finding homeless people to talk to, but like maybe, but she'd make it work. She'd sell it. So thank you for coming on the show, Caryma. Tomorrow, I'm about to play the preview for this, but tomorrow I have Dr. David Jacobs, and he's just going to talk about what it's like. He's a radiologist. Okay, he's not a virologist. I'm not trying to get him to come on and like tell anti-vaxxers what to do, but he's on the ground floor. So we're going to be talking to him. Thanks again to Caryma, and yeah, thanks for joining us.